Lawyer declines to represent black woman. Later learns she's the judge for his biggest case. Victoria Belmont stood by the expansive windows of her high-rise office in the heart of San Francisco's financial district, her eyes fixed on the sprawling cityscape below. The late afternoon sun painted the buildings in golden hues, casting long shadows on the streets. From here, she could see the relentless march of the city, with its bustling crowds and flashing billboards. Yet, she felt detached from it all. To the outside world, she was a force, an accomplished black billionaire with a growing tech empire. Her company, Belmont Dynamics, had changed the landscape of the digital world, making her a household name in Silicon Valley. But the truth was, behind the success, she carried a quiet burden, one she'd learned to hide beneath a carefully constructed facade of confidence and strength. Today was one of those days when the weight of it all felt heavier. She had spent the last few hours in meetings with her legal team, discussing the details of a high-profile case that could shape the future of her business. The legal battle was complex. Allegations of corporate espionage, intellectual property theft, and unfair competition. She needed the best representation, someone who could navigate the delicate intricacies of such a case without hesitation. After careful consideration, her team had suggested Miles Harding. Miles Harding was a name Victoria knew well. He was the head of Harding & Partners, one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. He had handled high-profile cases, from celebrity divorces to corporate mergers, and his reputation was untouchable. For a case like hers, he seemed like the perfect choice. Victoria knew that securing him as her lawyer would not only give her the best chance of winning, but also send a clear message to the opposition. She wasn't someone to be underestimated. She had never met him in person, but from what she had heard, Miles was as sharp as they came, demanding, confident, and a man who valued precision above all else. As she thought about it, she couldn't help but wonder how he would respond to her. Would he see her as just another powerful woman in a business suit, or would he recognize her for the force she truly was? The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., and Victoria was ready. She had made sure every detail was accounted for. She knew the facts of the case inside and out. She knew what was at stake. She had done the work, and now it was time for someone who could handle the legal intricacies of it all. Her assistant, Chloe, knocked lightly on the door. "Miss Belmont," Chloe said, her voice tentative. "Mr. Harding has arrived." Victoria straightened up, composing herself. "Send him in." A moment later, the door opened, and a tall man with dark hair and a perfectly tailored suit entered the room. His presence was imposing, every inch the successful lawyer, Miles Harding. She rose from her desk to greet him, extending her hand. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "It's a pleasure to meet you." He took her hand, his grip strong but not overpowering. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, though it seemed more out of politeness than warmth. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Belmont," he said smoothly, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced air of disinterest. "I must admit, I've heard a lot about you." Victoria could feel the weight of his gaze, but she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago not to let anyone see the cracks in her armor. "Thank you. I've heard a lot about you as well," she replied. "Let's get straight to the matter at hand." Miles nodded, taking a seat across from her. He opened the folder in front of him, his eyes scanning the documents. "Your case is impressive," he said, his tone businesslike. "But let me be frank. It's also complex. The opposing side will have their best people working on this, and there are several high-risk factors that could complicate things." Victoria's gaze never wavered. "I'm aware. That's why I've sought out the best." Miles leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her. "I'm not sure if I'm the best fit for this case," he said, his voice tinged with an air of indifference. "I handle corporate cases, sure, but I don't typically get involved in cases that are this messy. The accusations against your company are complex. Intellectual property theft, corporate espionage. It's all a bit complicated for me." Victoria felt a momentary surge of frustration, but she didn't let it show. "I don't want someone who will shy away from the hard cases. I want someone who's willing to fight for me, no matter the challenge." Miles's eyes flicked to her with a hint of skepticism. "Miss Belmont, I understand your position, but you're a billionaire. You could afford anyone in this city. You could hire a team of lawyers to handle this case for you. I'm just not sure it's worth the effort." There it was. The subtle dismissal, the unspoken assumption that because she was a woman, and a black woman at that, she couldn't possibly be worth his time. It stung, though she had heard it all before. For a split second, she felt the old familiar anger rise up inside her, but she held it back. Instead, she let out a slow, controlled breath and gave him a small, polite smile. "I understand your concerns," she said, "but I would suggest that you reconsider. This case will be bigger than anything you've ever handled before, and I need someone who can see beyond their own biases and handle it with the skill and professionalism it deserves." Miles's eyes flickered, but he quickly masked whatever emotion was stirring beneath the surface. He shook his head, his voice laced with finality. "I'm sorry, but I don't think this case is the right fit for me." Victoria stood up from her chair, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing her disappointment. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Harding. I appreciate your candor." As she walked toward the door to escort him out, Miles stood, his expression unreadable. "Good luck, Miss Belmont. I'm sure you'll find someone who's a better match." And with that, he left. Victoria returned to her desk and sat back down. She felt a knot in her stomach, but forced herself to focus on the task at hand. She had always known that people like Miles Harding existed, people who believed that success came to those who were the most privileged, not the most deserving. But this time, she wouldn't let it get to her. She had come too far to be discouraged by someone like him. There was a world full of lawyers who would jump at the chance to represent her, and she would find the one who would see her for what she was, a force to be reckoned with. But little did she know, fate had a different plan. The next time she saw Miles Harding, it would not be in a boardroom. It would be in a courtroom. And he would learn that his rejection of her was just the beginning of a much larger, life-changing journey. And for him, it would be a journey of reckoning, not just with her, but with himself. Victoria Belmont leaned against the railing of her penthouse balcony, her eyes scanning the skyline. The city had a rhythm, a pulse she could almost feel in her chest, though tonight it seemed distant, almost foreign. It had been a week since her encounter with Miles Harding, and despite the initial sting of his rejection, she felt strangely indifferent. She had dealt with far worse in her life: racism, sexism, and every subtle and overt form of discrimination imaginable. But she had always risen above it, grown stronger, and proved the world wrong. Her company, Belmont Dynamics, was her life's work, a vision she had fought for, sometimes at the expense of relationships, friends, and her own sense of peace. But moments like this, when she felt pushed aside by someone she had sought out for help, made her question if it was all worth it. She had always been careful with her emotions, keeping them in check like a finely tuned machine. But the rejection from a man like Miles Harding, who had already carved out a reputation for himself, felt like a personal affront. He had dismissed her. No, not just dismissed her, but had let her walk out of his office as if she were just another client, unworthy of his time. The hum of her phone pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced down at the message on the screen. It was from Chloe, her assistant. "The case against your company is gaining traction. The media is starting to pick up on it. We need to prepare." Victoria sighed, running her fingers through her hair. It wasn't just the legal implications she had to worry about. This case threatened everything: her company's reputation, her future, and her influence in the tech world all hung in the balance. But she wasn't afraid. She had weathered storms far greater than this, and she wasn't about to let this one bring her down. She sent a quick reply to Chloe, and then turned her attention back to the view. Her thoughts, however, kept circling back to Miles Harding. Why had he rejected her so decisively? What had he seen in her that made him so certain she wasn't worth the effort? Was it her race? Was it the fact that she was a woman? Or had he simply been too blind to see the power in front of him? She had already succeeded in a world that had tried to keep her out, but in his eyes, she was still just another wealthy woman asking for legal help. She was just another case to be dealt with, nothing more. That evening, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that their paths were destined to cross again. She didn't know how or when, but fate had a way of working itself out, didn't it? Little did she know, that would be the very next day. The courthouse was a massive building, its stone walls radiating authority, its halls echoing the footsteps of the many legal professionals who passed through it daily. Victoria was no stranger to the world of law. Over the years, she had sat in countless meetings with her own team of legal experts, pushing her company through numerous challenges. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't there to fight for herself or her company. She was there to preside over one of the most high-stakes cases of her career, and the weight of it pressed heavily on her shoulders. The case involved not only the accusations against her company, but also the exposure of some of the darker, more corrupt corners of the tech industry. It was going to shake the very foundations of the corporate world. As the judge, Victoria had to remain impartial, calm, and methodical. Her reputation as a fair and unyielding judge was on the line. And yet, as she made her way through the corridors of the courthouse, she could feel a stirring inside her. This was more than just another case. This was personal. As she entered the courtroom, she caught sight of the legal teams gathered at the tables, her eyes immediately searching for the one lawyer she didn't expect to see there, Miles Harding. The moment their eyes met, everything seemed to slow. His face paled as he recognized her, the expression on his face shifting from professional calm to something almost unrecognizable. Victoria could see the wheels turning in his head, his realization dawning on him. He had no idea she was the judge for this case. Miles had thought his path had crossed with hers only once, in the form of a meeting that ended in rejection. But now, he stood before her, as if facing a storm he had unwittingly walked into. His confidence, which had been so apparent in their earlier meeting, was gone. In its place, there was hesitation, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in his demeanor as he tried to mask the surprise. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, though Victoria could detect a faint tremor. "I didn't realize. I didn't know you would be overseeing this case." Victoria gave him a small, controlled smile. "I understand. It's an unexpected turn of events." She motioned for him to sit down. As she took her seat at the bench, she glanced over at the opposing counsel, then back at Miles, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the room fell silent, the tension palpable. Miles's discomfort was almost tangible, and Victoria could feel the weight of the irony in the situation. Here was the man who had dismissed her, unable to recognize her worth, and now, here she was, holding the fate of his case in her hands. But despite her personal feelings, she maintained her professionalism. She wasn't here to settle scores. She was here to ensure justice. The case needed to unfold according to the law, not based on her emotions or past grievances. The trial began, but Victoria's mind kept drifting back to Miles. He was competent, no doubt about it. His arguments were strong, and he commanded the room with the same confidence he had exhibited during their meeting. But as the hours passed, Victoria couldn't shake the sense that his composure was slipping. She could see him glancing at her more than was necessary, his posture rigid, his eyes avoiding hers whenever they met. For the first time in a long while, Victoria found herself feeling something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was empathy, or maybe even curiosity. She had no intention of letting him off easy. He had made his choice when he turned her away, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But part of her wondered, as the trial wore on, if he had learned something in the process. Miles was a man who had always been in control, a man who believed in his own superiority. And yet, here he was, at her mercy, relying on her impartiality and expertise to determine the outcome of the case. The irony was too rich to ignore. As the day drew to a close, Victoria's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had spent so much time building Belmont Dynamics, so much time proving herself in a world that had constantly tried to push her down, that she had never stopped to consider the emotional toll it all took. The rejection she had felt from Miles had stung more than she cared to admit. But now, sitting in the judge's seat, she realized that it wasn't about him anymore. It was about her journey, her growth, and her ability to rise above the judgment of others. And somewhere deep inside her, a small voice whispered that, in the end, this trial was more about him than it was about her. The courtroom was silent as the gavel came down, the sound resonating through the air, signaling the end of another long day in the trial. Victoria Belmont felt the weight of every moment pressing down on her shoulders. The case was intense, far more than she had anticipated when she agreed to preside over it. There were layers to it that reached beyond the immediate allegations, layers that threatened to expose corruption at the highest levels, not just within the tech industry, but within the legal and political systems that supported it. As she rose from the bench, she glanced at the room. The eyes of both legal teams focused on her every move. She could feel the scrutiny, the expectation of her decision. It was inescapable. As the judge, she held their futures in her hands. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, there was an additional weight on her heart, one she hadn't anticipated. She gathered her files and stood to leave the courtroom. The trial would resume the following morning, but tonight she needed space to think, space to breathe. But as she moved toward the door, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. His presence had a way of filling the room, even when he wasn't speaking. It was a presence that couldn't be ignored. "Miss Belmont, Your Honor." Miles's voice was hesitant, lacking the bravado it had carried when they first met. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time since the trial began. Miles stood at the threshold of the courtroom, his posture stiff, but his eyes searching. He was no longer the confident lawyer who had dismissed her with such arrogance. There was something raw, something unspoken, in the way he held himself now, as though he was wrestling with something inside that he couldn't quite put into words. "Mr. Harding," Victoria replied, her voice calm, her expression unreadable. She had learned to guard herself against whatever emotions the situation might stir. But despite the barrier she had erected around herself, something about Miles's presence unsettled her. He hesitated before speaking again, his words coming out carefully. I owe you an apology, Your Honor. When we met before the case started." He paused, looking for the right words. "I didn't see you for who you really were. I made assumptions that were wrong, and I'm sorry." Victoria studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of the arrogance he had worn so easily the last time they'd met. But now it was gone. What remained was a man who seemed vulnerable, uncertain, almost human. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Harding," Victoria said, her voice soft but firm. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. The sting of his dismissal still lingered, but she was learning that forgiveness was not for him. It was for her. "But you must understand that this is not about me. This is about the law, about justice. And right now, we're both on the same side of that. I'm here to do my job." Miles nodded slowly, his face tightening as he absorbed her words. "I understand," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving her. "But I didn't just reject your case that day. I rejected you, and that's something I can't take back." Victoria took a breath, exhaling slowly. It was a moment of honesty, and as much as she didn't want to admit it, she felt a stirring inside her, an unfamiliar twinge that made her heart race. She had spent years shutting down parts of herself to survive, to excel in a world that often felt like it was built against her. But Miles's words, his raw admission, had cracked something inside her. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but it was there, alive and pulsing beneath the surface. "Why did you come to see me, Mr. Harding?" she asked, her voice quieter now, a touch of curiosity creeping in. "Why apologize now, when you've spent the last few days acting like nothing's changed?" Miles's eyes darkened slightly, and for the first time in their interactions, he seemed unsure of himself. His confidence, that hallmark of his character, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. "I came because I've been thinking about what happened," he said, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself, "about how I treated you. And I realized I was wrong. I was blind, and I didn't take the time to truly see you. And I regret that more than I can say." Victoria didn't speak immediately. She just stood there, allowing the silence to fill the space between them. She had heard these kinds of apologies before, had seen men like Miles Harding offer words without understanding the weight behind them. But something in his eyes told her that this wasn't just a formality. It wasn't just for show. For the first time, Miles Harding was vulnerable, and it was a vulnerability that she couldn't ignore. "I'm not some token, Mr. Harding," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I'm not here for your redemption or your apology. I'm here because I have a job to do, because this case, this entire trial, is bigger than both of us." He nodded again, this time more vigorously, as if her words had hit a nerve. I know, and that's why I want to make it right. I want to prove to you, in whatever way I can, that I'm more than the man you saw before. I'm not just a lawyer. I'm a man who has learned, who has grown, and who is finally ready to do what's right." Victoria regarded him for a long moment, her mind a swirl of conflicting emotions. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected any of this. But as she looked at Miles Harding standing before her, vulnerable and remorseful, something shifted. Maybe it wasn't about him proving something to her. Maybe it was about him proving something to himself. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice softening, "you may have learned something, but that doesn't mean it's enough. You have to show me, and everyone else, that you've changed. Actions speak louder than words." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his gaze intense. "I will. I swear I will." And in that moment, despite the anger and frustration that still simmered beneath the surface, Victoria saw something in him that she hadn't seen before, an earnestness, a determination to be better, not just for her, but for himself. Miles didn't ask for her forgiveness, not yet. But what he did offer was a promise that perhaps he would be the man she had always hoped he could be. And maybe, just maybe, it was a promise worth considering. As the door to the courthouse closed behind them, the sound of footsteps echoed in the empty hall. Victoria's thoughts lingered on the man she had just confronted. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. The path ahead was uncertain, and yet, for the first time in a long while, Victoria felt the stirring of something new, something that might just change everything. The days following Miles Harding's apology passed slowly, as though the universe itself had taken a deep breath and held it, waiting for something to happen. Victoria Belmont felt the weight of the trial more deeply with each passing moment. It wasn't just the case itself that weighed on her, but the ever-growing tension between her and the lawyer who had once dismissed her with such certainty. She had thought that she could let it go, that the emotional toll would fade with time, but Miles's words lingered in her mind, echoing through her thoughts like an unanswered question. Had he truly changed, or was this just another of his calculated moves, designed to mask his earlier mistake? As the next few sessions of the trial unfolded, Victoria found herself observing Miles more closely than she cared to admit. Gone was the confident, cocky lawyer who had once dismissed her without a second thought. In his place stood a man who was quieter, more introspective. He seemed to be struggling with something, as though the very ground beneath him had shifted, and he was unsure of where to place his feet. His arguments were sharper, more focused, but there was a subtle fragility in his demeanor, a vulnerability that was so rare in the world of high-powered attorneys. Victoria didn't want to feel sympathy for him. She didn't want to acknowledge the change she was seeing. She had spent years cultivating an unshakable resolve, a wall of indifference built from every slight, every insult, every moment where she had been overlooked or underestimated. Sympathy was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when so much was at stake. And yet, when she watched Miles during the trial, a part of her, small and quiet, wondered if his transformation was real, if perhaps the man standing before her was not the same man who had so arrogantly rejected her. One evening, after the trial had adjourned for the day, Victoria lingered in the courthouse, alone in her chambers. The building was quiet, the usual hum of activity long gone. She stood by the window, gazing out at the distant skyline, her thoughts far away. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the responsibility she carried, not just for her company, but for every decision she made in this case. She had worked so hard to get to this place, to prove herself in a world that had never fully accepted her. She couldn't afford to be distracted, not now, not when everything she had built was on the line. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be a message from her assistant, Chloe. But when she saw the name on the display, her breath caught. It was Miles. For a moment, Victoria hesitated. She had no desire to engage with him outside the courtroom. Not yet. Not when everything was still so fragile. But curiosity, that quiet whisper that had been growing louder in the back of her mind, urged her to answer. She picked up the phone, her fingers slightly trembling as she pressed it to her ear. "Miss Belmont." Miles's voice came through, steady but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Victoria took a breath, her mind racing as she searched for the right words. "Mr. Harding, to what do I owe this call?" He paused, as though he were carefully choosing his words. "I wanted to apologize again, not just for the meeting we had before the case, but for how I've been handling things in the courtroom. I've been distracted, and I'm not sure if I've been doing the best job for you or your case." Victoria's brow furrowed slightly. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, but there was something deeper, something vulnerable beneath the surface. "You've been handling things just fine, Mr. Harding," she replied coolly. "This is a complex case. We all have our moments of distraction." But her words felt hollow to her. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to reassure him or to reassure herself. The truth was, she had noticed his growing focus, his sharper arguments, but she couldn't afford to acknowledge it. Not yet. "I know I haven't been at my best," he continued, "but I want you to know that I'm committed to making this right. Not just for the case, but for you, for your company. I don't want to let my mistakes from the past define the work I do now." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her thoughts a whirlwind. She wasn't sure why this apology felt different from the others. She wasn't sure if it was the quiet vulnerability in his voice or the weight of the case itself pressing on them both. But something in his words stirred something inside her, a recognition perhaps, that his transformation wasn't just professional. There was something more personal at play here, something real. "I appreciate that, Mr. Harding," she finally said, her voice softer now. "I'm not one for easy forgiveness, but I respect that you're willing to show me a side of yourself that I didn't think existed. Let's keep our focus on the case. We both have a lot to prove." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a brief silence that lingered longer than either of them had anticipated. "Agreed," Miles said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "Thank you, Miss Belmont. I'll see you tomorrow." Victoria hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, the weight of the conversation sinking in. She wasn't sure what had just shifted between them. She wasn't sure if she had given him a chance or if he had, in turn, earned it. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that this case, this trial, was more than just about winning. The next morning, as Victoria sat at the bench, she couldn't help but notice the subtle change in the air. The courtroom felt different today. The usual tension between the opposing sides seemed less charged, less antagonistic. It was as though both teams were carrying a shared understanding, a sense of collective purpose rather than a desire to defeat each other. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was enough for Victoria to notice. Miles Harding was standing at the defense table, his posture more upright than it had been before. His eyes met hers across the courtroom, and for the briefest of moments, there was a silent understanding between them. He wasn't just fighting for the case anymore. He was fighting for something more. And somehow, Victoria found herself believing in him, if only just a little. The day's proceedings were intense, as they always were, but there was a quiet strength in Miles's arguments, a precision in his words that made Victoria realize just how far he had come. He had not only learned the intricacies of the case, but had also learned to respect the process, to respect the people involved. It wasn't just the work that had changed, it was him. As the trial adjourned for the day, Victoria found herself standing outside the courthouse, staring at the setting sun. The sky was streaked with deep hues of purple and orange, a reflection of the quiet storm that still raged within her. She hadn't expected to feel this way, not after everything that had happened. But as Miles walked towards her, his steps slow and measured, she knew that something had shifted between them. She wasn't sure where it would lead, whether it would end in respect or something more, but one thing was certain. This case had become far more than just a legal battle. It had become a reckoning for both of them. The courtroom was quieter than usual the next day, the sound of turning pages and murmurs of the legal teams filling the air. It was the calm before the storm. Victoria knew the high-stakes case she was presiding over was nearing its climax, and the weight of it all was beginning to press down on everyone involved. The media was watching closely, and both sides of the courtroom seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the final pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. As she sat on the bench, listening to the arguments unfold before her, Victoria couldn't help but think about how much had changed in the past few days. It wasn't just the case that had become more intense. It was the relationship between her and Miles Harding. She hadn't expected to feel this way, this pull, this quiet curiosity about him. But there it was, deep and undeniable. He had apologized. He had shown a side of himself that she hadn't thought possible. But as much as she wanted to dismiss him, as much as she wanted to keep her heart guarded, she couldn't help but wonder, was this change real? Or was it just another layer of manipulation, another ploy to win her favor? Miles had been a man of arrogance and pride, someone who believed that the rules didn't apply to him. She had seen it in the way he dismissed her, the way he had underestimated her before they ever met. But now, as he stood in the courtroom presenting his arguments, something about him was different. He was meticulous, deliberate, focused not just on the case but on his words, his every gesture. He was no longer just a lawyer. He was someone who had learned, who had been forced to look inward and confront his own demons. Victoria shifted in her seat, glancing over at him. He was talking with his team, his brow furrowed in concentration, his voice low and steady. There was no arrogance in his demeanor now, just a quiet determination to get it right. And despite her best efforts, despite the walls she had built around herself over the years, she couldn't help but feel a spark of admiration. Later that afternoon, when the court session had adjourned for the day, Victoria found herself standing alone outside the courthouse. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the steps. She liked this time of day, the quiet before everything became frantic again. She leaned against the railing, taking a deep breath, trying to center herself. Her mind kept wandering back to the trial, to Miles. She hadn't expected the shift in their dynamic to affect her so deeply, and yet every time she caught sight of him, it was like something inside her, something she thought she had buried long ago, stirred. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her from her thoughts. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. Miles was always punctual, always precise. "Miss Belmont," he said softly, his voice carrying an unspoken weight. "I hope I'm not interrupting." She turned to face him, a small, composed smile on her lips. "Mr. Harding, I wasn't expecting you." Miles stepped closer, his expression guarded, but with an underlying vulnerability she had started to notice more and more. "I wanted to talk to you, away from the courtroom, away from the case." He paused, as if considering his next words carefully. "I've been thinking about everything, about how I've treated you, and about what I've learned." Victoria raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What exactly have you learned, Mr. Harding?" He took a step forward, his hands clasped in front of him, as if trying to keep his composure. "I've learned that power doesn't come from the position you hold. It comes from how you treat others, from how you show respect. I've learned that it's not enough to be good at what you do. You have to be a decent person, too." Victoria studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to gauge the sincerity in his words. He had said all the right things before, during the trial and in their earlier conversation. But now, in this quiet moment, with nothing but the sound of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves around them, she was forced to confront a question that had been brewing inside her for days. Was this real? Was he truly changing? "I don't know, Mr. Harding," she replied, her voice low, measured. "People say all sorts of things, but what matters is what you do, not what you say." Miles's face softened, and for a brief moment, the guarded lawyer facade slipped away. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to prove that I've changed, not just in my work, but in how I see the world, how I see you." Victoria felt a flicker of something stir within her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was the recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, this man before her wasn't as one-dimensional as she had once thought. He opened up in ways that were rare for someone like him, someone who had built his career on pride, on the belief that he could control every situation. And here he was, standing before her, raw and vulnerable, admitting his flaws. She glanced away for a moment, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The night was falling quickly, the sky turning darker by the second. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. But in this moment, she couldn't deny that something had shifted. "I've spent my whole life proving people wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Proving that I'm worth more than what they think I am. I've had to fight for every inch of respect I've earned. And you made me feel like I was nothing more than another case to you, another client you could dismiss without thought." Miles's face tightened, as though her words had struck him deeply. "I know," he said, his voice low, "and I can't take that back. But I can show you that I'm not the same person I was." Victoria exhaled, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. "Actions, Mr. Harding. Actions speak louder than words." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know, and I'm ready to prove it. I'll do whatever it takes." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. It was clear to both of them that this wasn't just about the trial anymore. This was about something deeper, about trust, respect, and the slow unraveling of their carefully constructed defenses. Victoria took a step back, breaking the silence. "We'll see, Mr. Harding. We'll see." As she turned to walk back toward her car, she couldn't help but feel that something had changed. The trial was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. But there was a new awareness between them now, a tension that wasn't just about winning the case. It was about something more intimate, more human. And as much as Victoria tried to resist it, she couldn't deny that it was there, simmering beneath the surface. It was a slow burn, and they were only just beginning to understand the full extent of what was unfolding between them. The trial had stretched on for weeks, but each day seemed to blur into the next. Victoria Belmont sat at her bench, the courtroom now a familiar space, its walls echoing with the heated arguments, the testimonies, the back and forth of legal minds at work. But her mind was no longer fully immersed in the case, not in the way it had been in the beginning. Every piece of evidence presented, Every strategy Miles Harding employed seemed to have less weight on her now and more weight on something else. It was the way he moved, the way he carried himself. There was something in his eyes when they met hers, a quiet but unmistakable shift. It was as though he was no longer just the lawyer on the other side of the table. He was something more, something real. And with each passing day, Victoria found herself drawn to that something, even though she tried desperately to resist. The trial was nearing its conclusion. The final arguments were being prepared, the last bits of evidence analyzed under the harsh fluorescent lights. There was no denying that the case had grown bigger than either side had initially expected. What had begun as a corporate dispute had become something of a battleground for the future of the tech industry itself. The stakes were higher than ever, and Victoria knew that the ruling she made would reverberate far beyond the walls of this courtroom. But there was still something else, something beneath the surface that had been keeping her up at night. Every time she looked at Miles, she saw the person he was becoming, not just the lawyer he had been. There was a shift in him, a quiet evolution. It was hard for her to ignore, harder still to resist. It happened on a rainy afternoon. The sound of raindrops tapping against the courthouse windows echoed in the quiet chambers, and Victoria found herself staring out into the gray sky, lost in thought. The trial had broken for the day, and the legal teams were dispersing, but she couldn't bring herself to leave just yet. Miles approached her desk, his footsteps deliberate but soft. He didn't announce his presence. He simply stood there, waiting. Victoria knew he was there before he even spoke, his presence somehow becoming familiar in the most uncomfortable way. "Miss Belmont," he said, his voice low, calm. "I was hoping we could talk." She didn't look up at him immediately, but her fingers froze on the stack of papers she had been reviewing. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his. The look in his eyes wasn't that of the confident, sometimes arrogant lawyer who had dismissed her all those weeks ago. There was a quiet intensity there now, a depth that had not been present before. "About the case?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "About everything," he replied simply. His words weren't rehearsed. There was no pretense, no legal maneuvering, just an honesty that caught her off guard. "I know I've made mistakes, but I want to be better. Not just in my work, but in how I see the world, how I see you." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't ready to hear this. She wasn't ready to let herself believe it. And yet, there it was. The sincerity in his voice was impossible to ignore. "Mr. Harding, this isn't the time," she said, her voice firmer now, trying to maintain control of the situation. "We're still in the middle of this trial. We have to focus on what matters, the case." He nodded, his face still drawn with that same quiet determination. "I know. I won't distract you. But I need you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere until this case is over. But even after that, I'm willing to do the work to prove that I'm a better man than I was when we first met." Victoria wanted to argue with him, to remind him of everything he had done, the ways in which he had dismissed her. But in that moment, she couldn't. The sincerity in his voice had a way of disarming her, of pulling her in despite everything. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with both confusion and curiosity. "Because I've realized that there's more to life than winning cases and gaining power," Miles said, his eyes never leaving hers. "There's real growth in acknowledging when you've been wrong. And I was wrong about you. I was wrong about how I saw you." Victoria could feel her pulse quicken as he spoke. It was too much, too sudden. She wasn't prepared for this, not yet. She had spent so much of her life building walls around herself to protect from people like him. But here he was, breaking those walls down with his words. "I'm not asking for anything, Victoria," he said, his voice softening. "Not now, not ever. But I want you to know that I see you. Not just as the woman on the other side of this case, but as someone who deserves respect, someone who deserves more than I gave you before." For a moment, the silence between them stretched on, filled with the unspoken weight of his admission. It was as though the room itself had become suspended in time, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Victoria allowed herself to feel the pull between them. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She wanted to ask him if he truly meant it, if he could ever truly change. She wanted to ask how she could trust him after everything he had done. But instead, she simply nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step forward. The next day, the courtroom was charged with an energy that felt different. The closing arguments had begun, and Victoria was back in her role as the impartial judge, directing the flow of the proceedings with a sharp eye. The lawyers were more focused than ever, their voices rising as they made their final cases. But as Victoria watched, something inside her shifted again. It wasn't just the case that mattered anymore. It was how far Miles had come, how much he had changed before her very eyes. Miles stood before her, speaking to the jury with the same precision he had used throughout the trial. But there was something more. He wasn't just presenting evidence anymore. He was presenting a story. His words were sharp, yet there was an undercurrent of humility in his tone, a recognition that this case was bigger than him. He had stopped fighting just for the victory. Now, he was fighting for something more. And as Victoria listened to his words, she realized something deep in her chest. The change in him wasn't just about the case. It was about him as a man. And somewhere along the way, she had begun to see him differently, too. When the arguments finally ended, Victoria sat back in her chair, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a storm cloud. It was almost over. The case would soon be in her hands. She would have to decide who would win and who would lose. But more than that, she would have to decide what this unexpected connection between her and Miles Harding really meant. The courtroom was empty now, the hustle and bustle of the trial fading into quiet reverence as the final moments approached. Victoria Belmont stood alone in her chambers, her gaze focused on the files laid out before her. She had read every word, scrutinized every piece of evidence, and listened to every argument. The facts were clear, the law had been laid out, and now it was time to make the decision that would change the course of this case and her life. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It never had been. The past few weeks had shown her something more, something she had tried to resist but couldn't ignore. The man who had walked into her office weeks ago with arrogance in his eyes and dismissiveness in his voice was no longer the man standing before her now. Miles Harding had changed, not just as a lawyer, but as a person. And somehow, without her even realizing it, she had started to change, too. Her thoughts drifted back to that day when he had stood in front of her, his voice steady but filled with vulnerability. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere until this case is over." Those words had stayed with her, echoing in the back of her mind even as she tried to focus on the task at hand. Miles had proven himself, both in the courtroom and outside of it. He had earned her respect, not just through his legal prowess but through his honesty, his willingness to face the mistakes he had made, and his desire to be better. He wasn't the same man who had dismissed her with a glance. He was someone who had seen her, really seen her, and had learned to value that. Victoria could feel the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. She wasn't just deciding the fate of a case. She was deciding whether she could trust the man who had been her opponent, whether she could allow herself to believe in the change he had shown. Could she forgive him? Could she allow herself to be open to the possibility of something more than just respect and mutual understanding? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Without waiting for a response, it opened slowly, and Miles stepped inside. He was dressed in his usual dark suit, but there was an unspoken tension in the air, a quiet understanding between them that neither of them had acknowledged before. "Miss Belmont," he began, his voice calm but laced with an underlying nervousness. "I know the decision is in your hands, and I'm not asking for anything, but I need you to know that whatever happens, I'm proud of what we've accomplished here. Not just in the case, but in how we've both grown." Victoria looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no arrogance in his words now, just sincerity, just vulnerability. She wanted to speak, to respond in kind, but the words caught in her throat. It wasn't the time, not yet. The decision still weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't afford to let herself be distracted by what was happening between them. "You've shown a lot of growth, Mr. Harding," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I didn't think I'd see it, but I have." Miles smiled slightly, the corner of his lips twitching upward. "I didn't think I'd see it either. Not like this." Victoria nodded, her gaze returning to the stack of papers on her desk. The case was still there, still demanding her attention. But everything felt different now. Miles was no longer just a lawyer. He was someone who had earned her trust in his own way. And she had come to realize that it wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about what was happening between them, what they had both discovered about themselves in this process. "I need some time to think," she said finally, breaking the silence between them. "Please leave me to it." Miles hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course, I'll leave you to it. But when you're ready to talk, about the case or anything else, I'll be here." As he left the room, Victoria turned back to the papers, the weight of the decision before her consuming her thoughts. She sat there in silence for a long while, the evening sun casting long shadows across her desk. In the end, she knew what she had to do. She knew where her heart lay, not just with the decision of the case, but with the man who had stood by her side, in his own way, throughout this entire process. The following morning, Victoria entered the courtroom once again, her robe flowing behind her like a symbol of authority. The room was silent as she took her seat at the bench, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had gathered for the final verdict. Miles stood among them, his expression focused but with a flicker of something deeper, something personal beneath the surface. She could see it, and for a brief moment, she wondered if he knew what was coming, if he had seen the change in her as she had seen the change in him. She cleared her throat and began to speak, her voice firm, steady. After careful consideration of the facts, the evidence, and the arguments presented by both sides, I have come to a decision. She paused for a moment, the weight of the room pressing in on her. This was it, the moment that would define everything, not just for the case but for her own future. The defendant is found guilty of the charges brought against them, she continued, her words resonating in the room. However, considering the mitigating factors, the sentence will be one of reduced severity, with an emphasis on rehabilitation over punitive action. In this case, justice is not simply about the law. It's about growth, redemption, and the opportunity to right the wrongs of the past. Miles's eyes met hers across the room, and for a split second, their gazes locked. There was no judgment in his eyes, no frustration, only understanding and something else, something deeper. The decision was made, but it wasn't just the verdict that had shifted. The journey had changed them both. They had each seen the other in ways they hadn't expected, and in that unexpected space, they had found something more than just respect. They had found an understanding, an unspoken connection that neither could ignore. As the court adjourned and the people began to file out, Victoria stood still for a moment longer. The trial was over. The decision had been made. But this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Miles stepped forward, his footsteps measured. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in front of her. And then, without a word, he reached out his hand, extending it toward hers. Victoria hesitated for only a second before taking it. And in that simple, unspoken gesture, everything shifted. They had both come so far, and now, together, they would see where this new journey would take them. As the final gavel fell, the courtroom fell silent. But the journey wasn't just about the verdict. It was about the people involved, two individuals who had learned to see each other in ways they never expected. Through twists and challenges, they discovered that growth, redemption, and understanding could change not just their careers but their lives. This story wasn't just about law. It was about the power of second chances, self-awareness, and learning to see beyond what's presented on the surface. It's a reminder that we all have the ability to change, to grow, and to rise above past mistakes. If you've enjoyed this journey of transformation, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next incredible story. You won't want to miss the lessons we'll uncover together in the next video.